I want you to help me guide the discussion here. I've been working on writing a book about developer relations. I'm about halfway through it, so my head is swimming with all kinds of developer relations concepts and ideas, but they're all sort of loosely organized. So if I start going off on a tangent or ranting, please gently guide me back to where you would like the discussion to go with the question. So to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the definition of developer relations, and starting with the event, the Eventbrite page included a little definition that I thought might be a good place to start with because I disagreed with a good amount of it, and I thought that seems like a good thread to pull on. So one of the things that definition says, let me see if I can pull it up here and read it directly. Of course, it's a different page on mobile. Well, anyway, it talks about how it's also known as platform evangelism, and it's used for essentially multi-sided platforms. And that used to be true, but I think one of the important questions there is how do you define platform, right? And that there's entire books on that topic, but for me, I think of a platform essentially a little bit broader than a multi-sided marketplace, right? I think of it as any service or tool that helps people build something. And that's a little bit different than if you think of like Amazon AWS, where I use their platform to build a product, which I then sell to someone else. And all of the different types of platforms, whether it's complete owner control, like integrator focused, sort of like I'm the Apple App Store, right? And I control everything you're allowed to do on my platform, up to I'm Twilio, and I'm just providing the ability for you to send SMS, and then you can sell that to whomever. All of those types of products and platforms can use developer relations. Really, developer relations is just about getting developers to driving awareness of your product, right? People aren't going to use your software or use your platform or integrate with your solution if they're not aware of it, right? And it's about helping develop trust and build authority, which is different than advertising or sales, right? So if you come into developer relations thinking like, okay, this is, we're going to give our evangelists a quota and they have to go sign up a certain amount of people, I would argue that you're probably looking at it from the wrong perspective, because the idea should be to build trust and authority, not to actually go contribute to the bottom line. So one thing I think a lot of people misunderstand right away is that developer relations, with very, very rare exceptions, is a cost center, right? It's not something where you're going to put 50 cents in and get $1.50 back the next year. It does not work that way. So there, I think, are a few important myths that need to be debunked before you are able to fully buy into the idea that developer relations actually makes sense and is worth investing your time into. First off, there's this idea that developers are somehow immune to marketing. There's this idea that they are so smart that they just are going to see through all of your attempts to influence their purchasing decisions, right? Which is usually, I mean, if you're a developer, you're probably going, yeah, we are smart and we do see through all of that BS. But that's shifted a lot, and I think part of the reason that has shifted a lot is because the nature of how we find out about products and test products and see if they're going to work for us has changed quite a bit. So also, there are some developers who never ever want to see your marketing, right? But they're going to use ad blockers, or they're going to have a proxy level Raspberry Pi server on their LAN blocking all of the ads for the entire network, right? They're going to only browse from the links on the command line so they don't have to see their banners, right? So the developers that hate your marketing message will find a way to filter it out. So don't worry about pissing developers off with marketing messages. They're actually out there now searching on Google to try and find solutions to their products, right? They're actively trying to find your marketing message, which is very, very different than 15, 20 years ago. So don't be afraid as a marketing department to market to developers. They are not all that scary. And as an example of this, who remembers the Heartbleed vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
That bug has branding and a logo, right? Like straight up, there's a website where you could go see the bleeding heart logo, right? And so even the software bugs have marketing now. So you can't tell me that marketing doesn't work on software developers, right? So that's one myth that you have to
So are you
debunk
saying
right away.
if your target market is software developers, like you should embrace marketing?
Yeah, don't think of marketing as a dirty word when it comes to software developers.
Okay.
And if you are in an environment where you feel that's happening, you need to figure out and get to the root of why. Because there's a chance that your marketing message actually is not resonating or is not the right approach. But you should be marketing to developers if your product is for developers.
What about internally, right? I mean, I think we have a cross-section of some good-sized enterprise, right? And I think internally, like marketing, products, features, capabilities in general sucks. There's like no focus. So do you have any kind of position or opinion or recommendation there?
On how to market your
like
developer
if you're working
tools
at
internally?
a
Or
10,000 person company and you're building something, some internal product or service that is targeted at a developer or subsection.
Yeah, I think the same things that help you show the value internally are similar to the things externally, right? And that's a lot of this. So there's a big overlap between what's called now DX or developer experience and DevRel. And DX is essentially when you think of user experience, right? It's different than the UI. The UI is the interface through which the user experiences your product. So you can have a really awesome UI, but if it makes the user feel frustrated, then it has bad UX, right? Similar thing in the developer relations world. You can have an API, but if it is really, really painful to implement and use, and if the documentation is bad, and if the SDKs don't actually cover all of the endpoints that you provide in your API, and people have to go hunting to make these things work, you have an interface for developers, but the experience for developers sucks. Big part of DevRel is to find and identify those gaps in developer experience. One, so that you can turn around if you work at a company or an organization that has a mature enough product organization to say, here's the reasons why demonstrating the value of this technical tool is difficult. It's hard to explain the value of it because it takes a day and a half for someone to set up their environment so they can actually get down and see if it solves their problem or not, right? That might, as a hypothetical. So you have to have some sort of idea on what are those barriers, right? And often I think they're because we don't have a strong product focus on what's on the developer experience side of things. How you go about fixing that institutionally at a 10,000 person company, I have no idea. I was
just admitting you have a problem is the first step.
Yeah, but those are the same problems that I deal with when I go out in the field and I sit down with developers and I say, okay, here's our API. Now I want to watch you try and build a solution using it, and you watch where they struggle, just like you would user test someone going to a UI for your website. You would see where they struggle and you would write down the problems and you would take that back to your product team and say, okay, these are some of the issues. I think we're going to see, especially getting off into the speculative a little bit here now, but in my opinion, as software tools become more and more productized, available as a service, easier to use, as all of the hard parts are abstracted away and we end up with more and more a collection of tools that we're sort of putting together, the barrier to entry to using these technically focused products, these products that are now for developers to achieve a good outcome, is becoming easier and easier. So it's not just necessarily developers you're selling to now, it's people who have enough of a motivation to solve the problem and just enough knowledge to find out how to do that. So developer relations, I think, is going to continue to broaden into maker relations or doer relations, right? You don't need to be a software engineer to necessarily go create a Twilio app these days, right? You can literally get the phone number and set up the TWIML bin and have, I mean, non-tech person could do it in 10 minutes. So DevRel is going to start having to work much more closely with product. So let's see. One thing I could do is talk a little bit about sort of the history of DevRel and how it emerged. Another myth that I run into all the time is people think evangelism or DevRel is new. And when I started in the field in 2011, I thought it was a new thing as well. But it's actually as old as the Macintosh. That team is where they actually came up with the title of evangelist, the original Macintosh. And it was a very different game back then, right? Because okay, we have this new platform. It's a PC. We need consumers to buy it. Consumers aren't going to buy it unless they have a spreadsheet application and software that makes it cool, right? So how do you incentivize developers to build software for your platform that has no audience? And it turns out in some cases they just opened the checkbook and ordered 100,000 copies from some of these developers. But the ideas and the ways in which you go about positioning your product started really with Guy Kawasaki and his team at Apple. Then it was used sort of, I would say, the dark side of DevRel emerged when Microsoft sort of took over in the 90s. They had this take no prisoners sort of approach, and if you actually read through some of their training materials, many of which became available because of lawsuits, you find interesting things like quotes from James Plamondon, who was the head of DevRel at Microsoft, saying literally like, get their junior developers alone, get them drunk, and pump them for all the information you can, right? That was part of the Microsoft DevRel strategy, codified in PowerPoint slides, right?
I wish I had that job. Like, you get developers drunk and get information out of it.
Yes. So
I think you do.
Actually, that's how I recruit.
yeah. So they showed that if you go to where the developers are and you offer them a solution to their problem, you can achieve results even if you're not worried about doing things the right way, right? They were not customer focused at all. They cared only about Microsoft, only about making things work for themselves, but still used evangelism and DevRel to, I mean, enormous effect. They were dominating the entire world at that point. Then there was a big important shift in 2000. Some people would argue Salesforce got there first. I would say they did, but it was unsupported, so it doesn't count. eBay launched the first real internet-focused platform for developers when they launched their API. And that really changed the DevRel game entirely, because now you're not having to go find, okay, you write software for the machine, for the people. It's, oh, okay, we can actually find our audience, connect with them. We don't have to fly out. Now we have all these new platforms that are being created that are online, right? It changed everything about how DevRel is conceived of, and they launched basically the API economy when they did that. That was the start of platform-focused
So I'm not
evangelism
really
for
familiar
online.
with what eBay did in
Yeah.
the API space.
They basically opened up their marketplace via API. So people were building tools and scripts to automatically post listings or manage their accounts.
Yeah.
So they provided an official channel to do that via API. So you
The
could
web service API.
yeah
Okay.
yeah. So you could post a new listing on your eBay account from your software using programmatically via their API.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a game-changing thing. That was the start of platform evangelism as it applies to the internet. The next big shift, I would say, came with really the launch of Twilio. they were the first ones to start applying the principles of platform evangelism to a product that didn't actually have a platform. And they achieved massive success with it. So they've sort of, and now I would argue that they're on a trajectory. People familiar with Twilio? I know there's a lot of you telephony folks, telco folks probably are, but they provide a platform that started off with an API for SMS, right? You wanted your like Uber or Lyft, right? When you are communicating with their drivers, that's actually going through Twilio's platform, proxying all the numbers so that their drivers aren't seeing your numbers, all of those sorts of things. I would argue that they're on a path to become a platform, but I mean, I work for a company now, Kickbox, where we have no intention of becoming a platform, but I'm out there in front of developers, showing them our products and showing them how to use our API, right? So it's not, those are sort of, if you still think of evangelism as only applying to platforms, you're gonna get it wrong, right? That was true up until 6 or 7 years ago. If you think of evangelism as only being applied by bigger enterprises, you would also be barking up the wrong tree. Although I did a search on LinkedIn recently, and there's over 1,500 people at Microsoft alone that have the word evangelist in their title, right? That's crazy. I think there's thousands at Amazon as well, but no one over there wants to answer my questions when I email them. But there's tens and tens of thousands of evangelists. The number of software developers is growing massively, 17% over the next 10 years. You have all of these, the Kauffman Startup Activity Index is at its highest point since 1997, right? So you've got more software developers, you've got more startups, and the bar to becoming a software developer is lowering. So all of these things mean that if you have a product that is going to be used by developers and you're not investing in getting out in front of those people and trying to win their trust and win the hearts and minds of these developers, you're going to basically be left standing on the shore while the boat's sailing. I've been talking for a while now, and people are probably like, what's going on? Questions? Specific things about DevRel? Like, I feel like I've been all historical and theoretical and no practical. I don't know.
Exactly. Like, I would love to hear maybe some like success cases or instances of like when you use that kind of evangelist. Like, and is evangelism, is software product or platform evangelism and DevRel literally kind of like one in the same? And then also, a couple of examples of like where it worked really, really well contrasted with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll start with an example of a story where DevRel worked really, really well for us at SendGrid. And just to give you the idea of sort of our approach and our ethos, I believe that one of the most important things about developer relations is increasing your opportunity surface area, right? The whole point is to go out to an event and maybe not necessarily have an agenda. You might have some desired outcomes, but you want to be willing to have that unexpected 30-minute conversation with the CEO of some company in the hallway. Or if you want to stay at the hotel near the venue so that you have more time at the party, even if it's going to be more expensive, right? That's sort of our philosophy. So one of the things that we did was we used to send our evangelists to hackathons, like TechCrunch Disrupt Hackathon. And this was, I believe, 3 years ago. We don't sponsor these events because they're $50,000, put your logo on it, right? But we can send someone and get them on stage to do a demo without having to sponsor, right? So one of our awesome evangelists, Kunal Batra, went to TechCrunch Disrupt, and he wrote absurd hack, right? And he basically, you could send an email to an address saying like, I've got $5.37 in my pocket. And it would send you an email back showing you exactly which things to order from Taco Bell to maximize the amount of calories you've got for your $5.37.
I love that.
Right?
That's awesome.
And so he built this, and he got up on stage with his 1-minute demo in front of thousands of people, at TechCrunch and demoed this product, and everyone in the audience is interacting with it while he's demoing it. Gets huge response. Taco Bell catches wind of it. It gets posted about on TechCrunch.com. Taco Bell invites our team to go visit the Taco Bell headquarters, which I wasn't part of the team that visited. 3 of our evangelists went, and they said it was like, and they said it was like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but with queso. So anyway, we got massive coverage and results and press out of not sponsoring this event, but sending one good hacker who had a brilliant creative idea and presented it in a great way. Then this team, after they met with Taco Bell, helped them. They were working on their mobile ordering app. They wanted some feedback. So through all of this, Taco Bell became a SendGrid customer, right? Pretty cool.
Which lets you know, that's like the baseline, right? The presentation of it.
Yeah.
There's been some really good products, but they never take off because the presentation was never there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but I will say, how it works for your specific organization depends on a lot of different things. If you're a product platform or an integrator platform, another thing to consider is, are you trying to do developer relations to a competitive marketplace? Like, is everyone who's using your product competing with one another? Or is it a collaborative community, right? Is it DevRel to something that's, are you offering professional services on top of something that's open source? So you have this giant collaborative base? Or is it App Store people where everyone wants to be the top of the search and they're all using you, but they're fighting with each other, right? These are all things that are going to change how you think about your strategy for your platform and your product. So there's no one-size-fits-all recipe for here's how you go do DevRel. And that's one of the reasons that I'm working on writing this book on developer relations, because I think right now if you go look for this type of thing, like there's a developer evangelist handbook written by someone 8-9 years ago who was at Microsoft. And it's like, here's what you do, prescriptive, go out, do these things day to day. And I read it and I was like, that's great, but I don't have unlimited budget because I don't work at Microsoft. I'm like, it's me and 2 people on my team, and we're staying at the cheapest Airbnb on the edge of San Francisco, right? Like, it's a different set of circumstances and different set of rules that apply. So I think it's one of the things that I'm trying to do is provide a theoretical basis to say, here's why these sorts of things work, so that people can derive their own strategy and tactics.
So the overlap with kind of like marketing and go-to-market is pretty phenomenal for me, right? Like some of the tactics that you're talking about sound a lot like what do they call it? Like guerrilla marketing tactics, where you're just kind of going in, getting embeds, and really kind of assessing that like product to market fit, but for a very unique and just a very unique community, right? Like you can't just show up with a sales guy trying to make them do stuff, right? You have to really kind of become one of them, or have it just seems like posers would get kind of flushed out of the ecosystem really quickly. Like it's like an organism that's just going to expel them unless you're doing things the right way. Which is kind of fascinating, because I've never thought about like go-to-market or product marketing that way before.
It's a big part of it is authenticity, right? And one of the ways when you're speaking to developers that you establish authority and authenticity is by, when I give a talk at a conference, I don't get up on stage and talk about the company I work for or the product that we're building or the next new thing we're launching. I share knowledge about something that I've learned during that, not talking about what's cool about the new version of our API, but here's a bunch of things that I learned doing API development and some best practices that I've derived that I want to share with people. I happen to have the companies that I work for shirt on while I'm doing that, right? But I'm not talking actively about that thing. And that, I think that's sort of the thing people get wrong when they start to think, oh no, you can't market to developers. You can, you just have to think about it a little bit more, like from a different angle. You have to think about how do we get these developers to trust us, right? And one of the things is if you say like, you know, freshens your breath and whitens your teeth, with a developer tool, it takes them an hour, maybe 5 minutes if you have good developer experience, for them to go, it actually didn't freshen my breath, what the hell's wrong with you, right? So you can't make these big hyperbolic claims.
Yeah.
You have to come at it from, one of the things that's worked incredibly well for me in DevRel is openly acknowledge your weaknesses and the strengths of your competitors, right? When someone is sitting down and asking you about your product and they say, well, how are you different from X, Y, and Z? We use this feature of theirs. If your feature is not as good, you should own up to that and tell them, well, you know, they do this better than us. By doing that, you establish credibility, and the thing is, you have that relationship now, and you don't know if they actually have a relationship with the competitor that they're talking to you about, right? And so for developer relations people, the worst thing is the customer that hates you but is quiet about it, because you have no chance to go figure out why and dig in.
Feedback, yeah.
Yeah, you have no feedback loop. I think one of the things you were getting at in terms of go-to-market and the overlap with product, right now there's such a gap. Okay, if you go to a boardroom full of C-level folks, all of them can evaluate and critique a user interface, right? They can all tell you,
Yeah.
well, I don't like the color, that button's too big, I would do this. They'd all have opinions. It's like the bike shed for the nuke plant, right? It's the easy thing, everyone can see it. Let's focus on that. If you go into that same room with an API and you say, what does everyone think? The people are gonna be like, what are you talking about? What is this? No one has any way to evaluate it. At SendGrid, that API interface was the majority of our revenue. So you would think the board might, or the execs might be interested in, like, oh, maybe
Like
how do we
interact
critically
with it,
figure
how's it working,
and analyze
what's
that? So for us as the developer relations team, being advocates for the developers goes both ways, right? We're advocating that they use our product, but we're actually advocating internally that we solve the problems and the product experiences that make it suck for developers to actually use it. So right now, DevRel, I think, in many companies, acts as that product feedback loop for the things that are harder for the upper levels to understand, right? You have to carry the torch for the people who are saying, hey, this API is hard to consume, into the room to the people who are looking at the API and going, I don't know, it looks okay to me.
Totally.
But
It's fascinating. It seems like, so what are the companies that have done this really, really well? Obviously, SendGrid has had amazing success. If I think about just straight up market share with kind of heavy API focus, obviously Amazon seems like they've done a great job. Is it doing things like reInvent, or is it way more kind of tactical?
Well, so AWS's approach is very different than GitHub's approach, right? GitHub is another company that I would say has done developer relations incredibly well, but you won't see them, there's very few GitHub evangelists, right? You won't see them at events, and you're not going to see them. You will sometimes, but they're very tactical, but they still have achieved massive market share in the developer marketplace, right? Versus AWS, they have thousands of evangelists.
And they spend so much
Yeah,
money to get there.
They literally hired a Microsoft worth of people last year, right? That's just a scale that is I can't even conceive of what their strategy and tactics look like, because it's just so different.
So how did GitHub do it so well?
How do they make money? They're just the source control system, right?
Yeah. So GitHub, was similar in some degree to how SendGrid was in their first couple years, where the problem that they solved was so strong, the pain point was so great that word of mouth just spread the solution very, very quickly. Also, the nature of GitHub is such that it is intended to be collaborative. So if I suddenly put my open source project on there that has 200 developers contributing to it, viral growth, right? Each of those developers signs up to contribute to that platform. They're like, oh, this is cool. I'm spinning up my code base now, inviting my collaborators, right? So word spreads quickly. I think Slack is an example of another company that's doing this, doing evangelism very, very well. They're doing it from an interesting perspective of trying to champion their product as being kind and friendly and inclusive, and positioning themselves not just as DevRel for solving the problem, but DevRel for this is the ecosystem and this is the community of developers that we want our brand to be a part of. So it's sort of continuing DevRel into not just building developer trust and influence, but hitching your brand's wagon to a specific type of developers, a specific developer ethos that you want to be reflected. That's the first time I've seen that happen, which is, I'm really curious to see how that goes for Slack.
So back to Sean's question, how does GitHub make money?
GitHub, well, I pay GitHub a monthly fee to store, so open source repos, public repos are free on GitHub. I have a bunch of private repos, code that I don't want to share with anyone, that's all free. So like SendGrid, all their code, Kickbox, all their code, it's on GitHub.
Yeah. Like the companies too, you have to pay for like a company profile plan. And
Yeah.
You have employees and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They also have training, so companies will pay GitHub to come to their company and say, like, teach our employees how to use Git, GitHub specifically, and maybe it's like their first like source control. So I think there's lots of trainings like that that GitHub
It's
is
like
like
open
taking
source
advantage of.
support and that, okay.
Yes, and I think one thing I would add on to for GitHub, like why they were able to be successful right away, is their documentation and everything online for getting started is really good. There's lots of different resources that they can use, and I think that helps once people hear about it, if they don't need someone's like hand to hold to get started, then that makes it really
I know
successful.
it's the integrated in Visual Studio now, so
Yeah.
Microsoft,
Yeah,
said you can pick TFS or you can pick GitHub, and that's pretty impressive.
yeah.
I didn't realize that kind of pool, so when it showed up, it was nice.
Yeah, and that's another example of they knew that as Jessica said, they knew their customer was a developer, so they made sure their developer experience was good from the beginning. And they are a totally remote team, mostly developers, and so they were dogfooding their product the entire time. They were building GitHub using Git, right?
Yeah.
So they knew here's the things that sucks about Git that we're going to solve with our abstraction.
So going back to your point, it seems like it's really important to not just try to, basically, again, to use another marketing term, to segment your target market. So when we were talking about Slack, they were okay saying, hey, we don't want everybody who can develop to be part of our addressable market. We want folks who embrace kind of the fun theme and kind of like attitude of interacting with Slack. So like, really focusing on like what segment of the developer community you want to solve for and interact with.
Yeah, so segmentation is important, right? One of the things that when I got to SendGrid, one of the big problems we had is we had no insight into how developers were actually using the platform. Weren't able to say, oh, here's the API endpoints that are being used the most, and they're being used by this client library, and we get a lot of traffic from these geographies, right? We didn't have any of that insight. So I think it's very important to actually instrument things so that you can see how developers are using your tools, so that you know where to focus your efforts, right? You have to have some sort of feedback loop and some sort of measurement metrics for what your team's doing, or you won't get anywhere. But yeah, it's interesting how.
So how did they tell you?
We looked at web server logs, the requests actually being made to the API endpoints, and then in all of our SDKs, we put a user agent header, which is like when you're browsing a website, you're using Chrome. Chrome says, oh, this is Chrome requesting this resource. Same thing with these SDKs. It would say, oh, this is the SendGrid node library pinging your API. So we'd be able to say, okay, we got a spike in Node.js users over the last month. Can we correlate that with some activity we did? If we can, let's do more of that. If we can't, let's figure out what this lever was and then start jumping on it a little bit more. But there's also this risk where you can segment things down to where it's just you and your cat, right? So you have to be careful about over segmenting and getting too specific. Like if you're just starting a DevRel program, right? Your metric should be, are developers using it, not what's the growth with Laravel PHP users.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Makes a ton of sense.
the part of the segmentation should be to identify, like all of the times that I've looked at the data, I've been shocked. Like, wow, the communities I thought were the most important are
Totally.
not the ones that the data says are important.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
Unless you have data that
Absolutely.
shows you what is kind of taken off and what's growing stale and not being used.
Yeah, and that's a big problem with DevRel is how do you actually measure your success, and how do you show people that there is long-term value in building these relationships? And you see DevRel programs get axed pretty regularly for a variety of reasons. Like a couple years ago, the entire PayPal evangelism team was just, we don't need you anymore, right? So you starting with data and measuring what you do, measuring, okay, when we launched this library, what happened to the growth, what happened to the API usage, what happened to number of installs, whatever your metric is, you actually need to be focusing on those sorts of things. But you can't let that be your entire strategy, right? Otherwise, what makes you different from sales? What makes you different from BD, right? The main difference for DevRel is that you're not pressuring someone to close the deal, because that's not how you're incentivized. You're there to establish a long-term relationship that's mutually beneficial. You're helping them solve a problem, you're bringing them into your network, you're connecting them to other people using your platform that they might be able to form partnerships, right? It's all of these, and you can get into crazy deep into multi-touch attribution models, but if it ultimately comes down to, another story from SendGrid, and you can Google this blog post, guy wrote it, called Forketing, but we had an evangelist at a college hackathon sitting with a student at 3 a.m. helping them solve a total non-SendGrid email related problem, right? Just, I'm stuck on this code and the hackathon demo's tomorrow, help me out. And so one of our evangelists sat down and helped this guy get the problem solved. And then a year and a half later, my timeline might be wrong, approximately, this guy's has graduated college, is in a meeting at his job, and they're evaluating email solutions, and they're like, what should we use? And he says, SendGrid. And they're like, why? It's like, I couldn't really explain why, other than, well, I really believe in their people, and they earned my trust when I was still a student, and they sat down and they spent their time with me solving a problem at 3 a.m. That doesn't show up. I don't care how complex your multi-touch attribution model is, that you're not going to get that wiggly line from that hackathon to that conversion event. It doesn't happen, but it's incredibly valuable. And that's really the stuff that I think is what DevRel ought to be doing. Now, you have to make sure that you have the numbers and the data so that they keep paying you and giving you budget to do all the stuff that actually matters.
Yeah, so that's very similar to something on the enterprise sales side we call a bluebird, right? But bluebirds really don't just happen out of the blue, right? Even though we call them that because they weren't necessarily in like forecast or pipe or whatever, but there was something somewhere that created awareness, interest, associated value with a need. And there isn't always like kind of that direct ratio of this equals, you know, a sale or a transaction later on down the road. It's
And then-
fascinating.
But that sometimes things work out such that, like, one of the things we used to do heavily at SendGrid was DevRel was actively involved with social media. And one night we saw, I don't even remember what the tweet was, Tumblr tweeted something about email delivery problems. And so we tweeted back at them from the SendGrid account like, hey, let's have a chat. And then we had Tumblr as a customer, right? So sometimes you do get that super quick, directly attributable touch point that's, you just lucked into it and you're like, hey, DevRel just got that huge account. And that's all about opportunity surface area, in my opinion.
Cool. So, I'm trying to tie it back to maybe some like day-to-day stuff. So what do you think, if you were just starting out in this effort, let's say you had a kind of new like you needed a position, your product or technology because of like some M&A activity, or you're at a startup and you know, it's kind of make or break time and you have to like get usage. What is kind of like the most important thing that you can do to kind of get started with this mindset?
Yeah, that is tricky. I think the most important thing is that you need to be successful in DevRel. At some point, you need some top-down support. It's really, really hard to do it from the bottom up. So I would say before you start these efforts, make sure that you have buy-in and you have someone advocating for what you're doing in the boardroom or at the C-level, right? You need someone who's like, when people are saying, hey, why are they spending all that money? You need someone who's gonna defend you. They will also help you figure out what are the things that are important to the business that we need to actually drive, right? I often see a disconnect between what the CEO thinks DevRel does and what the people actually doing DevRel are doing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's never a good sign. So you want to make sure that you're clear on like, okay, why are we doing this and what are the objectives from that top-down perspective. Then I think it really comes down to, again, what type of platform and what type of community or marketplace you're trying to jump into, right? Because you can incentivize behaviors, but the way you incentivize behaviors when all of your customers are competing with one another versus when they're all collaborating are very different. But we have seen some really good results with just like geeky giveaways, like which sounds silly, but you can be like, hey, build, like an online hackathon, build something using our product, and that you can, publish and show to the world, and then we'll give away some cool prizes, and you can, one company that I know of gave away a $100,000 top prize, right? Which got a lot of activity from around the world, and a lot of.
Was it a cash prize?
I think it was. Yeah, I think it was. And I've seen, there's people will go to great lengths at hackathons to incentivize people to use their products, sponsoring hackathons and giving away prizes. That's one of the things we did at SendGrid very early, because it was essentially doubled as like free user testing for us, right? Because when you're like, hey, you have 2 days to build a thing and you have to use this in it. If it sucks to use your thing in that constrained amount of time, they come find you and let you know about it. Yeah, absolutely.
It's like forcing that user feedback. I think because some of the work that like you've done in the past, right? Like as you create those consumables via like kind of advanced analytics or like data products or whatever, that could be really interesting as you look at your customer community to create incentives,
and something like that,
competition almost.
Right, but that's like, immediate feedback, right? So when you do any of those things, and it helps, and it would be huge in a lot of companies, because you go down these rabbit holes, basically, you know, working on something that you think somebody wants, and you find out they really wanted this
Mhm.
particular solution instead. So I can definitely see that as a huge benefit.
And yeah, you see that with, you know, it's sort of like you do have a run the risk of when you're developing a product of just not validating it often enough or soon enough. And I think DevRel is one of the major reasons to have it, is to have that strong feedback loop.
Yeah, and I would even argue inside of enterprises where it's a little safer to get it wrong because you don't have like the ultimate like revenue impact. That if you can do something like this, it can really differentiate like your internal brand or the internal brand of like your product or service or whatever you're doing. Cool.
I have a question, Brandon, if you
Yeah.
So for our company, we're not really developer focused, right? We're like B2B health tech stuff. Do you think there's a reason to build brand awareness with developers and like hackathons and evangelism? Like what would that look like for like a non developer focused company, I guess?
Yeah, I would think long and hard about if that's worth the investment. I would guess that those dollars would probably be better spent on straight up biz dev or sales, or DevRel could look sort of like partner engineer, sales engineer ish, where if you do have an API that some of your partners use to integrate with internally, but it's not an open API, so that would be, you could do some sort of product evangelism, but it would ultimately be with the goal of closing the deal.
Right.
So that's a little bit different.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but happy to talk more about your specific, you know, we can drill into your business and your market and all that and talk about it more if you want.
Cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, anybody who's connected remotely, we actually have quite a few folks. I think this is our biggest level of remote connectors. So, you know what I'll do? I'll try to take you all off of, I'm gonna unmute everyone, so hopefully we don't get some weird feedback loop. And just feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Any questions for Brandon out there? Yeah. Okay, well, we'll leave them off.
Cool. Well, I've got one. I said I was going to dispel a couple myths, and I only dispelled one. The second myth I want to dispel is that there's this myth, and it grew out of early constrained access to computers and all of that. But please stop thinking of software developers as awkward and taped up glasses and pocket protectors and Revenge of the Nerds, all of that stereotype, right? I know it's shocking how many times I meet with people who still think developers are, you know, essentially Milton from Office Space, right? It's like, if you have that mindset and those biases, when you go out to talk to software developers, they'll pick up on it.
For sure.
And yeah, software developers are definitely very interesting, strange creatures, and we get very passionate about weird hobbies and become nerds to that degree. But most of us are not super awkward. I don't think it's any broader distribution of awkwardness than any other population. So I would say please just try to dial that back a little bit, especially if you work in DevRel.
I think most software developers actually like their quirkiness and their odd, idiosyncrasies, and they're aware of them. And
Yeah.
I don't think they think of themselves as nerds or undesirable. They think of themselves as a clique.
Yeah.
They're pretty happy to be nerds. So.
Yeah, but usually they're like, oh yeah, I love this specific weird kind of anime or whatever, but they're not awkward about it, and they're well spoken and articulate when they talk to you about it most of the time. So there's a difference between quirky and awkward for sure.
Yeah, and like being a software development manager, the fact that I was a developer for so many years and still actively trying to keep myself somewhat current, they really respect that over
Mhm.
like, you know, someone that's kind of just more manager and just kind of got in there another way. Like they know they don't relate, you know,
Yeah.
100%.
Absolutely, and that's one thing I will say too. If you are working in DevRel, you need to be able to walk the walk. Like if you haven't been an engineer or written code, like you're gonna struggle.
Yeah, learn.
Yeah.
I have a question. Things are changing so fast, and you know, here we are. For those of you who are gonna join me, we're sitting at Business College on the campus of the University of Denver, and I just kind of see this gap widening in between like kind of traditional learning and institutional based learning and some of these concepts that are spinning up like so fast. So do you have any kind of thought or opinion, or what are you observing in terms of actually creating some training around something as important as DevRel?
Yeah, so there definitely has been a bit of a rise of interest in DevRel. There are now some conferences specifically about DevRel. DevRelCon is one that I highly recommend. There was a conference last week in San Francisco called DevXCon that was sort of a combination of developer experience and DevRel. So we're just getting to the point now where there are resources and workshops available. The DevRelCon and DevXCon, they had a second day optional workshop where you could pay to get some training, that sort of thing. But that's one of my primary motivations for writing the book that I'm writing. There really isn't a comprehensive resource that talks about the history, the theory, and the practical of developer relations. So I'm hoping that this sort of resurgence of dev relations and the growth of it leads to more resources and more training, because I think we're going to need a lot of it very, very soon. But right now, we're just sort of on the start of that becoming widely available, I think.
Have you seen any of it start to make its way into curriculum, even at, you know, maybe not a traditional like university or college, but any of the code schools? Have there, you know, kind of been segments on that?
I don't think so. I've gone and spoken at a couple code schools around Denver about developer relations. So I think there's interest, and I think especially when people find out what the job entails. And I went to 17 countries over the last 6 years, right? That was really, really cool, and I got to meet.
All about DevRel?
Yeah, and that was all for SendGrid, right? And I got to go do all these cool things. So when you meet with young engineers, and you can be like, hey, you know, your career doesn't have to be sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours a day. They get interested in that, and they want to learn more. I think we need to define things a little bit more from the business side to make it more clear to enterprise companies what is actually the value, and how do we define this, and how can we use it for our business before you'll start seeing it trickle down to curriculums. But maybe I'm wrong.
Cool.
I
Well,
think those boot
hopefully
camps are
so.
too early to be talking to people about to be doing training for developer relations. They should go to boot camp and then go work in the industry for a year and get some more street cred and then go, because that's going to help them with their authenticity, and also using some maintaining a code base for longer than 2 weeks, you know. And I think that kind of accruing that understanding of code debt and going in and reading someone else's code completely could be hugely successful for them in their career and for them working with people in hackathons.
And that's the path you've been on, right?
Yeah.
So you went to Turing Academy 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And spent 2 years
Yeah, I guess shameless plug.
in engineering, and now she's transitioning to DevRel.
Cool.
So-
And then where were you engineering yet again?
Parkify. Started
Okay.
in Denver.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
So I think I had some audio messed up here, so I'll go back out to the bridge, maybe call out a couple of folks who I know aren't shy. Austin, Subu, you guys have any kind of questions or comments? I think it's close to both of your areas. Sorry guys if you are asking questions and they're just not coming through. Maybe try the chat box. Okay. All right, well, thanks for the time. It was really absolute new area for me and very, very insightful. And we'll make sure to share all of your contact info.
Cool. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more in depth about it with anyone who's interested. And more specifically, since that was sort of just a shotgun smattering of a variety of topics.
Okay, cool. So yeah, they were trying to interject, but they didn't have any specific questions. There was some agreement. Developers are not awkward at all. I think you struck a chord there. And then just some thanks from the audience.
Fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you to the audience for listening to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon.
Cool. All right, guys. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.